Elite SWAT sharpshooters were missing every shot at a distant target, while an old man in worn jeans stood watching them from the shadows. When he quietly offered advice about reading the wind, they mocked him and called security to remove him. What they didn't know was that he was a legendary military sniper who'd written the doctrine they'd failed at all morning. And what happened next silenced every doubting voice on that range. Before we dive in, tell us in comments where in the world you are watching from. The rifle cracked and the round sailed past the target, kicking up dust in the dirt berm behind it. The SWAT sniper stayed frozen in position for a moment, as if refusing to accept what just happened, then slowly lifted his head from the scope. That made 7 consecutive misses. 7 attempts by some of the city's most trained sharpshooters, and not a single one had come close to hitting the small metal disc swaying 200 yards downrange. It was supposed to represent a hostage-taker's hand in a high-stakes scenario, the kind of precision shot that justified the department's investment in advanced training and equipment. Instead, it was becoming an embarrassment. The chief stood behind the firing line with his arms crossed, watching his elite unit unravel under pressure. This demonstration was supposed to showcase their capabilities to visiting officials from neighboring agencies, but what they were witnessing instead was a masterclass in making excuses. The lead sniper finally stood up and brushed the dust off, his pants shaking his head as he walked back toward the equipment tables. He muttered something about the wind patterns being impossible to read between the buildings, how the crosscurrent was creating unpredictable drift that made any calculation worthless. His spotter nodded in agreement, backing him up with technical jargon about atmospheric pressure and thermal currents that sounded convincing enough. If you didn't know any better, the next shooter took position with renewed confidence, certain he could compensate for whatever his predecessor had missed. He adjusted his scope, checked his breathing, and squeezed the trigger with textbook precision. The bullet went high and right, missing by nearly 3 feet. He immediately blamed the scope mounting system, insisting something had come loose. During transport, another shooter stepped up, made his own adjustments based on what he thought he'd learned from watching the others fail, and sent his round into the dirt 2 feet left of the target. The frustration was spreading through the team now, each miss compounding the pressure on whoever came next. Equipment bags were being opened and reopened as shooters double-checked their gear, looking for some mechanical explanation for why their training was failing them. Before we continue the story, please subscribe to our channel. Standing well back from all the commotion, almost forgotten against the fence line, was an older man who didn't belong to any tactical unit. He wore ordinary jeans and a jacket that had seen better years, with a faded baseball cap pulled low over gray hair. Nobody had introduced him or explained why he was there. Most of the SWAT team hadn't even registered his presence beyond a passing glance when they first arrived. He looked like someone's retired relative who'd gotten permission to watch the training out of courtesy, the kind of observer you ignore because they're clearly not part of the operation. But while the shooters were busy examining their rifles and arguing about wind calculations, this man stood perfectly still with his hands in his pockets, his eyes never leaving that distant target. He wasn't studying the shooters or their technique. He was reading the range itself, watching how the wind moved through the narrow corridor between buildings, tracking the subtle patterns that everyone else was calling random and impossible. His face showed no judgment and no eagerness to step forward. He simply watched with the quiet patience of someone who already understood exactly what was happening, and why the SWAT commander had seen enough. His jaw was clenched so tight you could see the muscles working beneath the skin, and the vein along his temple pulsed with each missed shot. City officials were watching from the observation deck, clipboards in hand, and what they were seeing wasn't the precision tactical unit they'd been promised in the budget proposal. The commander turned away from the firing line, ready to call the whole demonstration off, when a voice cut through the tension from somewhere behind the group. "You're not accounting for the thermal column coming off that south building." The words were quiet but clear, spoken with the kind of calm that suggested the speaker wasn't looking for permission to talk. Everyone turned to see the older man. Stepping forward slightly, one hand now out of his pocket and gesturing toward the tall concrete structure flanking the range. Your bullet's passing through at least 3 different air currents before it reaches the target. The wind at your position isn't the wind at 100 yards, and it's definitely not the wind at 200. You're calculating for conditions. Bet don't exist where it matters. The lead sniper straightened up and stared at him with unconcealed irritation. Here was someone who clearly had no business being on a tactical training range, offering advice that sounded like it came from a different century. "This isn't Vietnam, Grandpa," he said, loud enough for the other team members to hear. A few of them smirked. "We've got ballistic calculators, range finders, and atmospheric sensors. We don't need guesswork and folklore about reading dust in the air." The old man didn't react to the mockery. His expression remained neutral, almost sympathetic, as if he'd heard this exact dismissal before and knew how it would end. "Your calculator's giving you numbers based on the conditions right here," he said, nodding toward the shooting position. "But watch the heat shimmer coming off that rooftop at about 150 yards. Watch how the antenna flag on the target frame is moving compared to the flag on this building. You've got a rotating thermal pushing your rounds left in the first half of the flight path, then a crosswind catching them in the second half. You need to hold for both, not average them." The commander's patience snapped. He stepped between the old man and his team, his voice dropping into that authoritative tone that didn't allow for negotiation. "Sir, this is a restricted training area. I don't know who authorized you to be here, but you need to step back behind the line right now." He glanced toward one of the officers standing near the equipment tables. "Actually, escort him off the range. If he refuses, call security." The old man met the commander's glare without flinching. His eyes were clear and steady, carrying something the younger operators hadn't earned yet. Not arrogance, not defiance, just certainty. One of the younger SWAT officers stood near the back of the group, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He was new to the tactical unit, still earning his place among shooters who had years more experience, and he'd learned quickly that keeping your mouth shut was usually the smartest move. But something about the way his team was treating the old man didn't sit right with him. He'd seen that man before, more than once, down in the precinct basement where the old range equipment was stored. He'd assumed the guy was part of the maintenance crew, or maybe a volunteer who helped clean the firearms training rooms. They'd exchanged nods a few times but never spoke. Still, there had been something in the way the older officers looked at him, a flicker of recognition that went beyond courtesy toward someone doing janitorial work. The rookie remembered a conversation he'd overheard weeks ago in the locker room. 2 senior patrol officers were talking about someone who used to come around back before the department upgraded all the training facilities. One of them had said something like, "That old guy cleaning the range used to be somebody, you know, like somebody." The other officer had nodded but changed the subject quickly, as if talking about it made them uncomfortable. At the time, the rookie had dismissed it as the kind of exaggerated legend that gets attached to anyone who's been around long enough. But now, watching the old man stand there completely unfazed while the commander threatened to have him removed, that half-remembered conversation was replaying in his head with new weight. The commander was still barking orders, gesturing for security to escort the old man off the premises, when the rookie quietly stepped away from the group. He pulled out his phone and moved toward the equipment shed, pretending he needed to check something with the spotting scope that had been acting up earlier. His hands were shaking slightly as he scrolled through his contacts and found the number. For Sergeant Hayes, the retired rangemaster who now worked administrative duties at the police academy. Hayes had trained half the department over his 30-year career and knew everyone worth knowing in law enforcement and military circles. If anyone could confirm or dismiss the rumors, it would be him. The call connected after 2 rings. "Hayes," the voice answered, gruff and distracted. "Sergeant, it's Officer Brennan from Metro SWAT. I'm out at the urban training range right now, and there's a situation. We've got an older guy here, civilian clothes, been watching our sniper demonstration. The commander's about to kick him out, but I think his name is Tom Riker. Does that mean anything to you?" The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to make the rookie's stomach drop. When Hayes spoke again, his tone had completely changed. The distraction was gone, replaced by something sharp and urgent. "Wait, Tom Riker is at your range, right now? This second?" "Yeah, he's here. Commander just told security to escort him out because he tried to give advice on the wind conditions, and do not let anyone touch him." Hayes interrupted, his voice low and intense. "Do you understand me? Nobody lays a hand on that man. I'm calling the chief right now. You keep everyone exactly where they are until I sort this out." The line went dead before the rookie could respond. The SWAT commander reached out and gripped the old man's upper arm, not violently but with enough firmness to make the message clear. It was time to leave. The old man didn't resist, didn't pull away, just looked down at the hand on his jacket with that same unreadable expression he'd worn since the morning started. The other officers watched, some uncomfortable but silent, others nodding in approval that someone was finally handling the situation. The rookie who'd made the phone call stood frozen near the equipment shed, his phone still in his hand, hoping desperately that Sergeant Hayes hadn't been exaggerating. Then they heard the sirens. 2 vehicles came racing through the facility. Gates, tires kicking up gravel as they accelerated toward the range. A black SUV with municipal plates led the way, followed closely by an unmarked sedan. Both vehicles had their emergency lights flashing, the kind of response you'd expect for an active incident, not a training demonstration. The SWAT commander's hand dropped from the old man's arm as confusion replaced certainty. Everyone on the range turned toward the approaching vehicles, the failed shooting exercise momentarily forgotten. The SUV skidded to a stop just beyond the firing line, and the police chief emerged before it had fully settled, his door slamming with enough force to echo off the surrounding buildings that the chief didn't acknowledge the SWAT team. He walked straight past the commander without a glance, his focus locked entirely on the old man standing near the back of the group. The tactical director climbed out of the second vehicle, a former military liaison who'd served in joint operations, before transitioning to law enforcement, and he moved with the same purposeful urgency. The SWAT commander opened his mouth to explain the situation, to justify why he'd been removing an unauthorized civilian from the training area, but the chief cut him off with a single raised hand. The gesture wasn't loud or aggressive. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of absolute authority and barely controlled anger. The chief stopped directly in front of the old man and extended his hand. "Mr. Riker," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent range, "I apologize for this misunderstanding. If I'd known you were going to be here today, I would have made proper introductions." The old man shook his hand without ceremony, a brief professional grip, and nodded once. The chief turned back toward the SWAT team, his expression hardening. "Commander, get your people lined up, right now." The team scrambled into formation, suddenly looking less like elite operators and more like recruits caught breaking protocol. The tactical director stepped forward and faced them, his hands clasped behind his back. "Gentlemen, this is Tom Riker, retired Army Special Operations, former sniper instructor for multiple Joint Task Force units, and the man who literally wrote the doctrine on long-range urban engagement that half of you studied in advanced training. He's got more confirmed precision eliminations in counter-sniper operations than anyone currently active in this hemisphere, and he helped design the exact kind of rooftop crosswind compensation strategies you've been failing at all morning." The lead sniper who'd made the Vietnam comment looked like he wanted the ground to open up beneath him. The tactical director wasn't finished. Mr. Riker consults for our department on specialized marksmanship problems when our own people can't figure them out. He was invited here today by my office to observe and provide feedback. Feedback, I might add, that you just told him to take somewhere else. The silence that followed was suffocating. The old man, for his part, stood exactly where he'd been. Standing all morning, hands back in his pockets, expression unchanged. The police chief turned back toward the old man with a question he already knew the answer to. "Mr. Riker, would you be willing to show my team how this shot should be done?" It wasn't really a request. It was an opportunity for a lesson that nobody present would ever forget, and everyone on that range understood it. The old man nodded. Once, a small economical movement, and stepped toward the firing line. He didn't rush. He didn't make a show of it. He just walked with the steady purpose of someone who'd done this exact thing more times than anyone could count. He knelt beside the rifle the SWAT team had been using, the same modern precision weapon with all its advanced optics and adjustment, systems that had failed to deliver results all morning. One of the officers moved to hand him a different rifle, perhaps thinking the old man would want his own equipment, but Riker shook his head. "This one's fine," he said quietly. "It's not the gear." That simple statement landed harder than any lecture could have. He picked up the rifle, checked the chamber out of habit, and settled into a seated position that looked almost casual compared to the rigid tactical stances the SWAT shooters had been using. His movements were smooth and unhurried, the kind of efficiency that comes from doing something so many times that wasted motion simply disappears. Before he even looked through the scope, he spent nearly 30 seconds just watching the range. His eyes moved systematically across the space between his position and the distant target, pausing on details that everyone else had been looking past all day. "See that heat shimmer rising off the south building's roof, about 140 yards out," he said, his voice just loud enough for the team gathered behind him to hear. Several officers leaned forward, following his line of sight. "That's warm air pushing up and left. Your bullet enters that column, and it's going to drift. Not much, maybe half a mil, but at this distance that's enough to put you off target." He pointed toward a rooftop vent on the opposite building, where a thin stream of exhaust was visible against the sky. "That smoke is moving almost perpendicular to what you're feeling down here at ground level. That's your mid-range condition. And it's stronger than what you're calculating because it's concentrated between those two structures. It's creating a channel." His finger moved again, this time indicating a piece of torn plastic caught on a chain-link fence about 60 yards downrange. It was fluttering erratically, pulling in a completely different direction than either of the other indicators. And that's showing you the surface-level crosswind that's chaotic and mostly irrelevant to your shot because your bullet's already climbed above it by the time it gets there. One of the SWAT officers, the same one who'd called Sergeant Hayes, spoke up hesitantly. "So how do you calculate for all three at once?" Riker glanced back at him, and for the first time that day, something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You don't calculate it. You feel it. You make your best read on where each current is going to push the bullet during each phase of its flight, and you hold for the combined effect. You're not solving for one wind. You're solving for the whole journey the bullet has to make." He turned back to the rifle and settled his cheek against the stock. "Your computers are giving you the average of conditions that don't exist. I'm giving you the reality of what that bullet is actually going to encounter." The range went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the environment itself wanted to see what would happen next. Riker's breathing slowed, became rhythmic and controlled, the kind of breath management that doesn't come from a manual, but from thousands of hours behind a rifle. His finger moved to the trigger with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. The squeeze was so gradual that nobody could pinpoint the exact moment the rifle would fire. Then the shot cracked across the range, sharp and clean. For half a second, nothing happened. The sound echoed off the buildings and faded into the distance. Then the unmistakable metallic ping of the bullet striking steel rang out, clear and perfect. The small target disc, untouched all morning despite dozens of attempts, swung violently on its mount from the direct center hit. The police chief didn't let the moment fade into awkward silence or congratulatory small talk. He turned to the SWAT commander and spoke with the kind of clarity that left no room for interpretation. "We're not ending this training. We're starting it over, and this time Mr. Ricker is going to teach it properly." The commander nodded immediately, any remaining pride from earlier completely erased by that single perfect shot. Within minutes, the entire tactical unit had been reorganized, rifles set aside, notebooks pulled from gear bags. They weren't shooters anymore. They were students, and the old man who'd been standing in the background all morning was now standing in front of them. Riker didn't lecture from authority or remind them of their earlier arrogance. He simply began teaching the way someone does when they genuinely want others to understand. The SWAT team sat on the concrete steps near the firing line, watching as he used a thin strip of cloth tied to a fence post to demonstrate how air moved differently at various heights. He picked up blades of grass and released them at different points along the range, showing how the same wind source created entirely different effects depending on where you were standing. He scooped a handful of dust from the ground and tossed it into the air, making them watch not where it landed, but how it traveled, the way it curved and twisted through invisible currents they'd been ignoring all day. The teaching wasn't theoretical. It was practical and rooted in the kind of hard-earned experience that only comes from making mistakes under pressure. Riker talked about shots he'd missed, engagements where his calculations had been wrong and the consequences had been severe. He didn't glorify his successes or position himself as infallible. He positioned himself as someone who'd learned through failure and wanted them to skip some of the painful lessons he'd had to learn the hard way. The SWAT officers leaned in, asked questions, tested their understanding against scenarios they'd faced in the field. The rookie who'd made the phone call earlier found himself sitting next to the lead sniper who'd mocked Ricker just an hour before. And both of them were equally absorbed. By the end of the afternoon, the department's tactical director had already made a decision. The advanced marksmanship curriculum would be expanded to include a mandatory training block on environmental reading and urban wind dynamics, and it would be officially designated as the Riker Urban Precision Module. The veteran accepted the honor with the same quiet humility he'd shown all day, mentioning only that he hoped it would keep future operators from making the mistakes that had once cost him sleep. The SWAT commander, who'd threatened to have security remove this man from the range, now sat in the front of the group with his notebook open, writing down every word, asking follow-up questions with genuine respect. The shift wasn't just procedural. It was cultural. A reminder that real expertise doesn't always come with the newest technology or the loudest voice. 3 weeks later, the rookie officer walked into the precinct's basement range to log some off-duty practice time and found Tom Riker at one of the cleaning benches, carefully reassembling an old bolt-action rifle. It wasn't tactical or modern, just a well-maintained hunting rifle that looked like it had been in use for decades. Riker glanced up, nodded in greeting, and went back to his work. The officer hesitated for a moment, then walked over and set his gear bag down on the adjacent bench. "Mr. Riker, I wanted to thank you for what you taught us that day," he said, the words coming out more formally than he'd intended. "I've been going back through my training notes, and I realized how much I'd been relying on the calculator to tell me what to think instead of actually reading what was in front of me." Riker set down the cleaning rod and looked at him with that same calm expression that never seemed rushed or judgmental. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last," he said. "Technology's a tool, but it can't see what you're not paying attention to." He gestured toward the small window near the ceiling of the basement, where late afternoon light was filtering through. "Next time you're walking through the city, Watch how the leaves move on different trees along the same street. Some will be still while others are moving. Same block, same moment, different wind. Flags around the city all tell different stories if you actually look at them. The world's always talking. Most people just stopped listening because they think their phone will tell them everything they need to know. He picked the rifle back up and continued his work. The conversation apparently complete in his mind, but its weight still hanging. In the air, the officer nodded slowly, understanding settling in deeper than it had even on the range that day. Riker wasn't just talking about shooting. He was talking about how you move through life, what you notice, and whether you trust your own senses or outsource your awareness to something that can't feel the world the way you can. Pay attention to what's actually there, Riker added without looking up, not what the screen says should be there. That's the difference between surviving and thriving, whether you're behind a rifle or just trying to make it through the day. The strongest weapon you'll ever carry isn't your rifle, your gear, or the latest technology that promises to make everything easier. It's the wisdom you've earned through experience and your willingness to keep learning, especially from people who don't look impressive at first glance. The world is full of unassuming heroes who've mastered things the rest of us are still struggling with, and they're standing right there in the background, waiting for someone humble enough to listen. If this story reminded you to respect the quiet experts in your own life, to pay attention to the world instead of just your screens, and to never stop being teachable no matter how much you think you already know, then take a moment right now. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment about someone who taught you something important when you least expected it. And share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that real skill doesn't always announce itself. The lessons are everywhere. You just have to be willing to see them.